This is a topic that I've seen discussed, I guess, increasingly on a regular basis now, which is the topic of men retreating from relationships or the idea of pursuing a relationship altogether. Now, Chris Williamson, I know, had covered this quite extensively in a recent podcast, but the premise of the argument he was making is that when you look at the research, particularly into dating apps, it shows that the majority of men in their 20s especially are just completely retreating from the idea of dating. It's almost as if they've just completely given up on the idea of it, or that it potentially highlights whether it's a decline in testosterone or just a complete lack of confidence. Something's happened to want to facilitate men just not bothering with a relationship whatsoever. I kind of wanted to give my own take on this because obviously I'm a guy who's now in my late 20s. I kind of wanted to share my perspective on the situation and I guess what I feel has potentially led to a lot of men deciding, you know what, I'm done with the idea of dating. Now, from my point of view, I actually think one of the biggest contributors to this change in behaviour when it comes to dating is the prevalence of social media, but more specifically, I think the emergence of Instagram, the emergence of TikTok. And what I mean by that, and particularly for those of you who are into pursuing self-improvement or setting up your own business, let's be honest, if you go on Instagram, 9 times out of 10, you're going to see a reel of like someone driving around in a Lamborghini, someone who's just earned a massive pump from Bitcoin, someone who's drop shipping and they're flexing the Rolex. There seems to be this increased expectation of men to achieve that level of success because it is literally thrown in your face as soon as you open up the app. I was actually thinking about it recently, but I remember like back in 2012, 2013, 2011, I mean, I would have been in my like late teenage years at the time. I was like 15, 16, even going through sixth form, but I never felt like back then there was this pressure to achieve like that level of success. Like I never felt the pressure of having to get a Lamborghini or making loads of money online. But I do think a big part of that is because back then, for a lot of people in the teenage years, or probably even in the 20s as well, you basically had Twitter, you had Facebook, and they're not necessarily platforms where people could just post these lavish lifestyles. And quite frankly, back then, I think the idea of drop shipping, the idea of Bitcoin, I'll say those two specifically, the idea of like the Dubai lifestyle wasn't really a thing. It didn't exist back then. And I think because of that, there wasn't this almost pedestal that men had to aim for because it simply didn't exist. I guess the other element of it too is there wasn't this 666 rule, which is like, 6 foot tall, 6 figures, 6 inches. James Smith kind of summarised it quite jokingly, but I thought in a really good way. Back then there wasn't that expectation either because it wasn't really highlighted on those platforms like Twitter, like Facebook back in kind of like 2012, 2013, 2014. It was only with kind of the emergence of Instagram that, as jokingly, that kind of became another benchmark that men had to achieve. So not only do you have to have a Lamborghini and have like a Bitcoin pump, you also have to be 6 foot tall, earning 6 figures. There's benchmarks that are now in place that men have to feel that they need to achieve as a bare minimum to be an ideal mate, an ideal partner for somebody else. In terms of why men are retreating from the idea of dating, I do think when I compare now to like the early 2010s, there's almost this kind of heightened expectation as to how your online profile needs to look, particularly with Instagram. Like you've got to get all of the perfect shots and the perfect angles, and there needs to be a really nice aesthetic to your profile, which back then didn't really exist. You had a profile, people knew it was you could post goofy pictures and people wouldn't think anything of it. But now there's this weird expectation that you can't really do that anymore. You can't be yourself, you've got to be serious and have a certain aesthetic to your profile. And I think for a lot of men, quite frankly, that's probably a lot of effort and something that I haven't seen discussed before, which is how you need to present yourself online. There's a certain, almost again, another benchmark, another expectation as to how you need to present in order to be an ideal partner for somebody else. Now obviously I've covered off this idea of kind of benchmarks and pedestals that men need to work towards, and it's interesting because I actually think a lot of people have seen it as a negative in that men are becoming almost demoralized by the idea of that, but I actually think it's a fantastic motivator because, quite frankly, you know, back in 2012, 2013, 2014, there wasn't a pedestal or an expectation to kind of work towards, because it simply didn't exist on platforms like Facebook and Twitter. Whereas now it feels like there's a real, you've got kind of a benchmark or something to aspire to work towards. You might not achieve it, but it's something to get you motivated and actually something to aspire towards, in terms of understanding that there are people out there who have these lifestyles that you see on Instagram, that you see on TikTok. And to me, that's quite motivating. Now, I guess the other element of it, and it really, this just depends on the type of personality you have. I mean, I've got quite a determined, gritty attitude. So if I see someone who's achieved a certain level of success, I think, wow, you're amazing, I want to be just like you. Whereas I think for a lot of people, there's maybe that temptation to look at that and just become deflated and just think, you know what, I'm never going to achieve that. So what's the point? I'm just going to give up. And I think that's the wrong attitude to have. I think it's the wrong approach to take. I think it's really a mindset issue. I think really you should look at that and say, okay, I might not get to the same level as someone else is at, but actually it's a starting point to work towards them, because even if I fall short of getting to where they're to, I'll still have achieved a hell of a lot in terms of development, in terms of success at an individual level. So I think it's fantastic.